It was the evening of March 28, 191,943. The night was falling quickly. The oppressing heat of the day was slowly replaced by the coolness of nocturnal darkness. The moon was rising into the star-studded sky over the protective ring of mountains that separated the desert of the endless sands from the grassy paradise of the Arthurian sanctuary. A bonfire was burning in the middle of the prairie. Its bright red and orange glow drew the people to it like flies to a bulb. There were at least 100 individuals sitting around the roaring fire. Mostly they were young children, although for these people, young meant being under 2,000 years old. They were Arthurians, a race descended from both elves and men. They were one of the few ethnicities who could claim true immortality. The youngsters gathered around the bonfire to hear a new song that was to be sung in honor of their guests. This was done in recognition for their brave deeds that had only occurred a few hours ago. The singer of the song was old Aldred, one of the oldest of the Arthurians still living. His right leg was unable to bend at the knee and he was forced to use an ornately carved walking stick to help him move. He stood before the gathered crowd, his long braided white beard glowed red in the firelight. He held out both of his arms in a welcoming gesture and smiled warmly, a twinkle in his eye. Sagas, said Aldred, his voice was rough, deep and powerful. Sagas are important to those of us who dwell between the earth and the sky. They connect us to our past and our long-lost ancestors. They teach us lessons on how to behave and how to react when faced with problems. The sagas of our greatest heroes inspire us to perform mighty deeds of daring and glory and acts of mercy and charity on those less fortunate than ourselves. The sagas are our most valued treasure, one that no enemy can carry off by force. Listen to my words, young ones, and take them to heart. Learn from them and remember them, for there will come a day when you will sit here in my place and tell them to those who are not yet born into this world. Hearken to me and grow your store of lore and wisdom. I am Aldred the Old, lore master of Arthuria. This little speech was the traditional way in which the storyteller began his tales. He looked into the faces of his audience and saw that they were enraptured by his voice, eager to hear him speak. Tonight is a truly special night, said Aldred, for tonight a new song will be entered into the annals of our people's history. The song of the defeat of Malgus the malicious, the foul-winged snake, the basilisk. All of the gathered youths booed and hissed at hearing the name of the hated enemy. Aldred raised up his arms for silence and the jeering quieted down. I know that you are loath to hear his name, he said, I am too. His name has become a byword for fear and misery amongst us. But now we no longer need to worry. Malgus is dead. A cheer rose up from the seated youths. And we have our new friends to thank for that, said Aldred, motioning to the odd-looking group that was seated next to him. This group consisted of 3 dragons, Amaron and his twin sister Twizel and her little whelpling. Next to the dragons were Jason Argonaut and his 2 cousins, Beatrice and Daniel. Next to them sat Mrs. Draconis and her son Asa and Jason's ward, Myra Allison Greenleaf, who was a she-elf. Were it not for their intervention, said Aldred, we would be sitting here in mourning instead of celebrating the downfall of an enemy who has hounded us for centuries. Hail Myra the Brave, cried one of the seated youths. Hail Daniel Serpent's Bane, called a second. Hail Jason the Bold, exclaimed a third. Hail Amaron Snake Slayer, shouted a fourth. Hail the friends of Arthuria, cried another. Hail. All of the youths howled at once. Aldred once again held up his hands for silence. Yes, hail them, he said, give them praise and glory, for they have indeed earned it. With that the old storyteller began the new song. Several of the youngsters had drums, lutes and flutes with them, and they began to play to the tune that Aldred was singing. As Myra and the rest of her friends later learned, it was a fairly common one. It was an upbeat and boisterous one, to be certain. The serpent is slaughtered. His fortune has stumbled. No longer a danger. Malgus is conquered. The serpent is slaughtered. His fortune has stumbled. No longer a danger. Malgus is conquered. Although he was fearsome, and the throne he did threaten. His strength did yet fail him. And his end it did claim him. Although he was fearsome, and the throne he did threaten. His strength did yet fail him. And his end it did claim him. Here the basilisk did perish. Here he did die at last. By dragon's wrath, and by mere child's plaything. Come, come and sing. The basilisk is decaying. The serpent is slaughtered. His fortune has stumbled. No longer a danger. Malgus is conquered. The serpent is slaughtered. His fortune has stumbled. No longer a danger. Malgus is conquered. At this point the music changed its note. Instead of the quick and happy melody, it was now a slow, somber tone. The bonfire seemed to grow dimmer at this change. Aldred continued singing. 3 queens of evil things fell out of the sky. 7,000 years have they come to our foster home. 9,000 of our kin have they stolen away. But now one of these queens has been damned and slain. Into the land of Helheim has she gone away. Hot fire burned within, hot fire burned without. Into the fire she willingly jumped. For Jessica knew only of death. Hellfire was her fate. Hellfire was her birthright. Although she tried to stave it off, her soul was claimed by darkness. She came with her sisters here, seeking their prize. Their serpents did carry them into our foster home. Here they sought the 2 who were foretold. One did confront them to save her new friend. The witch did give chase to them. Into the tunnels she followed them. She sought to catch them both and with her sisters slay them. Myra and Asa fled into the darkness. There they did separate and sought to confuse the huntress. Jessica was not confused and followed Myra. She cornered the little elf and in the darkness fought her. There she was slain by steel, pierced through her blackened heart. Her Highness Princess Lisa it was who finally slew her. She stabbed that fiend through the back, then through the wicked heart. Jessica did cry out in horrid fear. Helheim did claim her there. Helheim did claim her. No more will she trouble us, for into darkness she's fallen. Myra sat and listened as old Aldred continued singing. He went on and on about how Amaron killed Malgus and how Jason had almost been carried off by the other witch, Byzantium, only to fight her off. The music went on, but Myra had stopped listening. She was caught up in the memory of her confrontation with Jessica. Myra couldn't remember ever feeling so scared in her life. Jessica had been the embodiment of wickedness and cruelty, as far as Myra was concerned at any rate. The witch had toyed with her, describing how she was going to skin her alive and send her into the desert to die. But then the Arthurian Princess Lisa had appeared and had killed the vile fiend before she could make good on her threat. I would have died if it wasn't for her, thought Myra as she gazed into the dancing flames. She looked at the glowing red coals in the heart of the fire and concentrated. Deep inside herself she could feel her magic stirring to life. Using her power she levitated one of the smaller coals and broke it into several smaller pieces. Then she attempted to rejoin the pieces back together, but all she managed to do was squash the bits into a misshapen lump. Jessica would have done that to me, thought Myra as a shudder passed through her. She looked over at Jason and Amaron and saw that both the young man and the dragon were enjoying themselves. They smiled and laughed as they were immortalized in song. But Myra saw that both of them were badly battered and bruised from their respective battles. Jason's left arm had nearly been ripped off at the shoulder and was currently hanging in a sling. Amaron's whole body seemed to be covered in gashes and welts. The dragon's right wing had been dislocated during his duel with the basilisk and was laying outstretched on the ground next to him. Several of his ribs had also been broken and cracked by the winged snake's coils. Both Jason and Amaron had also been poisoned by their foes and they were still suffering from the aftereffects. They were lucky to be alive. What would I do if you died, thought Myra as she gazed at Jason. At that moment Jason turned his head and glanced over towards her. Their eyes met and Jason's smile fell slightly. The concern on Myra's face must have shown. They looked at each other for a few moments. Don't worry about me, his expression seemed to say to her, I can take care of myself. Myra nodded in silent reply. Jason returned the nod and turned his attention back to old Aldred singing. Don't ever leave me alone, Myra thought as she continued looking at the young man. I don't want to lose you too. Before long Aldred had finished his singing to the cheers and applause of his young audience. He bowed before the youngsters, then he turned to Myra and her group and saluted them. May your songs of victories always increase, he said to them. Thank you, replied Myra, it was nice of you to do that for us. It is our way to sing of the deeds of our great heroes, replied the old man, to do otherwise would be considered an insult to you. Well, thanks for not insulting us, chuckled Jason, although if you did slight me in your own language I doubt I would be able to understand it. I would, Amaron grunted. I would never do such a thing, cried Aldred. Jegville, din Kortvarajkur, muttered one of the youngsters, a sullen-looking boy who wore the yellow and gold colors of the tribe of stags. His cheeks were hollow and his nose was short and sharp. A scar cut his left eyebrow in half while a blue and red tattoo of a spearhead was set under his right eye. His face was screwed up into a grimace of anger and resentment. The two boys who sat on either side of him swiftly cuffed his pointed ears and scolded him in their native language. "Curb your tongue, little stag," warned Aldred in common speech, "or your jailers might see fit to discipline you more harshly." "They are our guests, Algar," said the boy who sat on his left. "You will not insult them again," the boy on his right said. Algar glared darkly at both of them. He was tied up with a heavy rope that was wrapped tightly around his middle. His hands were bound behind his back with leather thongs. The reason for this was because Algar was a prisoner of Crest, _son, the boy who sat on his left. He was the leader of an Arthurian boys' militia or fur. The fur was a system of training young boys into becoming fierce warriors. The boys were forbidden from using real swords during their training bouts. Instead they used wooden facsimiles of the weapons that they would one day use against their enemies. There were several fur within the sanctuary, all of whom were bitter rivals against one another. This was also part of the system of training. Each fur controlled a territory within the sanctuary and was expected to protect it from all of the others. At the same time they were expected to raid the lands of their rivals, stealing their herds of cattle and horses and kidnapping the members of their rivals and selling them back for a heavy price. It was during one of these cattle raids that Algar, along with many of his own fur mates, had been captured by Crest's band. He was now being held for ransom, a ransom that would consist equally of golden shekels, silver pennings and several herds of horses. Algar's face went red at the mere thought of it. The shame of it all. "What did he say?" asked Daniel Argonaut, the newest member of Crest's band. "Nothing really," replied Crest, "he's just cranky." "You would be too if you were hogtied like this," spat Algar, struggling against his bindings. "It's your own fault for getting caught," said the boy who sat on his right. "Oh shut up, Eric," grunted Algar, "or do I have to remind you of the time I caught you trying to steal my prized mares?" Eric looked away from Algar and cleared his throat nervously. "I didn't think so," smirked Algar. "Don't listen to him, Eric," said Crest, "he's only making you feel bad so he doesn't have to think about his own ransom." "Hold Keft," Algar spat in his native tongue. "How much will we get for him?" asked Eric. "A whole third of his hoarded wealth," replied Crest, his face beaming. "I'm worth 10 times as much," grunted Algar. "So you're saying that we should have demanded that your fur give us your entire treasury for your release, is that it?" laughed Crest. Algar opened his mouth to reply but then realized what he had just suggested. He clamped his jaw shut and glared into the flames that danced in front of him. His cheeks flushed red. The gathered youngsters burst into laughter. Myra looked on and shook her head. These Arthurians were so strange to her. She had read stories about them when she had been studying with her tutor, Mr. Julius Goatman. She had envisioned them in her mind's eye while she had read their sagas, but to actually see them, speak with them and listen to their songs and tales was another matter altogether. Everything that she had learned about them was true, their sense of honor and duty, their fearlessness in battle and utter devotion to their friends and families. All the stories had been true. She looked over towards Daniel and studied him for a brief moment. A week ago she had seen him dressed in what would have been considered very normal clothing, a white shirt, brown trousers, black leather shoes and a simple tan vest. But since he had been made a member of Crest's Fur he had worn a woolen tunic, linen trousers that bulged around the thighs, a heavily padded jacket called a gambeson and over that a chainmail coat of riveted iron rings. Almost all of the other boys wore the same as he did. The only difference was that they were each wearing a different color to signify which tribe they belonged to: green for the dragons, blue for the wolf, red for the bear, yellow for the stag, purple for the owl, brown for the boar, gray for the hare, white for the dove and a combination of all the colors for the tribe of seers. Daniel's clothes weren't dyed any particular color, instead they were the drab off-white of newly spun wool. Despite this difference, Myra thought that if she hadn't known any better she would have believed that Daniel was also an Arthurian child instead of being a human boy. Although that being said, she too was wearing an Arthurian dress. It was one of the most beautiful gowns that she had ever worn in her life. Myra would have easily passed as an Arthurian maiden while wearing it. As she admired herself she looked over towards Jason once again. He was still wearing his Agro-Calestian olive drab-colored militia uniform, steel helmet, trench boots, flak vest and all. Jason looked every inch the soldier that circumstances had forced him to become. Just then something small and white whooshed overhead with a hellish screech. All the boys visibly flinched. Several of them dove to the ground and curled up into tight balls while others grabbed their round wooden shields and held them up for protection. Jason cursed loudly and looked up crying, "What the hell is that?" "Ginny," shouted Crest, his face aghast with horror, "sound the alarm." There was a mad dash as the boys scrambled for the wooden weapons. They drew out their practice swords and held up the poles that served them as spears, ready to fend off this flying intruder. Ho, 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 laughed old Aldred, don't be too hasty, Master Crest. I think you'll find that someone is having a joke at your expense. Crest, who was just about to blow a warning blast on his war horn which would have been heard for miles around, glanced at Aldred with a puzzled look on his face. The old man smiled and pointed upwards. Crest, Eric, Daniel, Myra, Asa and the rest looked up at the column of smoke that rose from the fire. The smoke was illuminated from below by the red flames, giving it the appearance of a fluttering banner. Hovering amidst the haze, its wings held outstretched to catch the rising air, was a barn owl. The white heart-shaped face gazed down at them with shiny black eyes. A whistle was blown close by and the owl flapped away. The youngsters watched it land on the wrist of an Arthurian girl who stood just outside the ring of firelight. She had long dark hair and bright clean eyes. A few freckles dappled the bridge of her nose. She wore a purple gown with a long skirt that trailed behind her as she walked. Myra recognized both her and the owl instantly. Hello, Tiller, she called. I hope I didn't scare you too much, said Tiller, glancing at the boys who had curled up in fright. Ah no, not at all, cried Crest, quickly hiding his war horn behind his back. Really, said Tiller, arching her eyebrow, you looked about ready to panic from where I was standing. Tiller walked up and joined the circle around the fire. The boys gave way to her and bowed their heads as she approached. She was the only daughter of Lord Tywin, chieftain of the tribe of Owls. The boys showed her the respect that she rightly deserved, despite the fact that many of them were quietly grumbling at her joke. Well, it is better to be safe than sorry, said Crest. I thought Sova was a djinn. Be grateful that we didn't bring our longbows with us or else you would be mourning your feathered friend there. He pointed at the owl with his wooden sword. I doubt that you'd hit him even if you had, said Tiller, stroking the owl's head with loving tenderness. Would you care to place a wager on that? Asked Eric. No, I would not, replied Tiller. I'd sooner be shot myself than let anything happen to Sova. The barn owl chirred softly and preened itself, running its beak through the downy feathers of its breast. Tiller turned to the owl and said, I know you could, but I don't want you to risk it. The owl hooted and opened its wings to their full span. Sova looked at the youngsters for a moment before flying off into the night. He came back a few minutes later with a fat field mouse hanging from its beak. He alighted on one of the logs that the youngsters were sitting on and began to devour his catch. Tiller sat next to Myra. I'm sorry about my little joke, she said to the she-elf, I only meant to frighten the boys. It's all right, he really didn't scare me that much, Myra lied. She looked at Sova and thought, how could such a horrible sound come out of such a beautiful bird like that? Well, he sure scared the hell out of me, said Jason, eyeing the owl with suspicion. Again, I only meant to frighten Crest and his fur mates, replied Tiller. Do you often play jokes on each other? Asked Jason. All the time, said Tiller. Hey, do you hear that, Daniel? Said Jason, you'll fit right in here. Of course he will, cried Crest. He's already proven himself to be one of the bravest amongst us when he shot his sling in Malga's eye. That was a lucky shot, I swear, said Daniel, I was aiming for his nose. Nevertheless, said Crest, if it weren't for you, Amaron might have been killed. Not might, would. Corrected the great grey dragon bull, I would have been killed by that winged snake if it wasn't for you, young Master Argonaut. Well, you're welcome, Amaron, said Daniel. The dragon bowed his large horned head to Daniel, who returned the nod. I guess we're going to have to add another name to your title, said Eric, Daniel Dragon Saver. What will you do with your portion of the ransom? Asked Crest. My portion? Asked Daniel. Yeah, your portion, said Crest. You were the first one who confronted Algar when he tried to steal our horses, so thus you will get the first choice of the loot. It's only fair, said Eric. Besides, Algar almost broke your arm during that raid. You're not just entitled to first choice of the ransom, but you also have a claim to a werigid as well. You said that before. Werigid I mean, said Daniel. What does that mean exactly? It means that he has to give you a certain amount of silver pennings to repay you for the injury that he gave you, said Crest, motioning to Daniel's bandaged arm. He does? Asked Daniel. How much? I would say that he owes you at least 300 silver pennings, said Crest. Daniel's eyes lit up upon hearing this. 300 silver coins. And getting first choice from the ransom as well. I'm going to be rich, he laughed. Well, I hope you haven't already made plans for the money, said old Aldred, because I'm uncertain if you'll get it or not. What are you talking about, old man? Asked Crest. The ancient Arthurian shook his head and pointed to the spot where Crest and Eric had been sitting only moments earlier, the place where Algar had been sitting between them. When Sova had whooshed overhead, both Crest and Eric had leapt to their feet to take hold of their weapons. Their prisoner had fallen backwards in fright and had lain with his bare feet pointing up at the starry sky. But now Algar was gone. "Where is he?" cried Crest. "Where'd he go?" "Listen," hissed Eric, and a silence fell over the gathered youths. They could hear the sounds of their ponies, which were tethered close by. They were champing at their bits and stamping their hooves into the soft earth. Their long hairy tails wished through the silent night as they fended off biting flies. Every now and then the beasts would whinny or grunt. Then there was another sound, the sound of a rope being cut and the sound of hooves clopping away. "Escape!" screamed Crest, "sound the alarm." Then everything happened at once. A dozen war horns were blown simultaneously. The boys, wooden weapons in hand, jumped to their feet and dashed towards their steeds. Many of them stopped to grab flaming branches out of the fire before they too ran off. They thundered towards their ponies to find that 2 of them were missing. They correctly deduced that while they had been listening to old Aldred singing, one of Algar's fur mates had stealthily crept up to him and had cut his bonds. When Sova had caused them to be distracted, Algar and his rescuer had taken the opportunity to flee, stealing 2 of their rivals' ponies to make good their escape. To add insult to injury, the ponies that had been stolen belonged to Crest and Eric. "He took my horse," cried an indignant Crest, "horse thief." He screamed after them. "Which way did they go?" shouted Eric. He got his answer when the sound of a pony whinnying and splashing through a nearby stream was heard off to the right. "That way," cried another youth. "After them!" Crest bellowed in an angry roar. The boys rushed to unhitch their steeds to give chase. They had all removed their saddles for the night and were forced to ride bareback after their quarry. Crest, on the other hand, ran to where Tilla had first appeared and found her pony standing just outside the ring of firelight. Crest leapt onto its back and spurred the little beast to a gallop. "Hey, he's mine," protested Tilla. "Curse you, Tilla, you and your bird have cost us a fortune." Crest shouted at her as he swept by. "Bring him back when you're done," Tilla warned. Crest rode up to the head of the riders and held his wooden sword up over his head. Tilla's pony reared up and neighed fiercely. "Fram! Hunters Meenir!" Crest cried in his native tongue as he charged in pursuit of Algar. "Re Som Vinden!" shouted Eric, who was riding double with another fur member. With that the entire band charged into the darkness, blowing their war horns, whooping and hollering like madmen. The sound of their war cries and the neighing of their ponies could be heard long after Myra and the others lost sight of them. "Let go of me!" Daniel shouted at Beatrice. Just as the boys were charging off, she had grabbed her little brother by the sleeve and held him back. "You're not going anywhere," she replied. "I might not have been able to stop you joining this fur thingamajig or whatever they call it, but I will do whatever it takes to stop you from hurting that poor boy." "What, you mean Algar?" asked Daniel. "You don't understand. This kidnapping and holding one another for ransom is perfectly normal for Arthurians." "You're not Arthurian," she cried. "You are my baby brother. Stop pretending to be something you're not." "Bad move, Beatrice," Jason muttered under his breath. "I'm not Arthurian," admitted Daniel, "but I am a member of Crest's warband." "Bjorna Brodre. What did you just say to me?" asked Beatrice, bewildered by her brother's sudden use of the Arthurian language. "Bjorna Brodre is the name of the fur that Crest is in charge of," replied Daniel. "It means the Bear Brothers. The fur that Algar runs is called Hjort Lancir, meaning deer lancers." "Well, no matter what you call it, you are staying right here with me," said Beatrice. She forced her brother to sit down next to her and held him in place. Her hand that was gripping his shoulder felt like a steel vice. "Let me go," he whined. "I'm not letting you out of my sight until morning," replied Beatrice. "But the hunt will be over by then," said Daniel. "Exactly," said Beatrice with a note of finality in her voice. "Take heart, little master," old Aldred said. "Daniel, there will be more hunts and chases in the future. Besides, your sister will not always be around to prevent you from joining the game." "Not if I have anything to say about it," glared Beatrice. "We'll see about that," grumbled Daniel. "Look on the bright side, Daniel," said Tilla. "Now you can keep listening to old Aldred's stories." "Good night, everyone," he grunted as he closed his eyes. "Good night, Jason," Beatrice and Daniel said simultaneously as they curled up next to each other. Amaron and Twizel were already lying down since they had reclined on the ground to listen to old Aldred's stories. They now coiled up their tails and wrapped their bat-like wings around themselves like blankets. They tucked their horned heads under their wings, and soon the sound of their snoring could be heard. Thin wisps of smoke rose from under their wings. Myra sat on the log bench and gazed into the fire. Her mind buzzed with questions about the stories she'd been told. She knew that she wouldn't get to sleep with her mind humming like this. Fairies are real, she thought. Does that mean that the tooth fairy is real too? One of the smoldering logs fell deeper into the fire, sending a shower of red gold sparks fluttering up into the air. Myra watched as they danced and skipped on the breeze and then faded away into nothingness. She imagined she could see fairies dancing amid the sparks, fairies made of glowing coals and embers with fiery wings. She pretended to watch them fly around her companions, their burning little figures illuminating their sleeping faces. Then one of the fae turned and looked at Myra. It winked and waved at her. Myra found herself waving back at the imaginary fairy. Then the small form rejoined the column of smoke and sparks and disappeared. The fantasy had appeared very real to Myra, almost too real. She was only too aware that she had a strong and vivid imagination, but that whimsy had almost appeared autonomous of her will. It seemed as though she were watching the pretend images instead of creating them in her mind's eye. Maybe it's this place, reasoned Myra. Being among the Arthurians must have affected her sense of make-believe. In truth, 1 month ago she wouldn't have believed any of her current circumstances could be true. She and her friends had been driven out of their homeland by the invading Sulian Empire, who had only invaded the Agro-Calestes because they had been looking for her. She had fled with her friends to Empire City, where she had found Asa and his mother barely surviving in the abandoned tunnels and sewers where they lived. Together they had escaped that city and had ventured into the endless sands, where they had made contact with the Arthurians. And only hours ago she, Asa and the rest of her friends had fended off 3 basilisks and witches who had attempted to kill them. What else is going to happen before this adventure is over, thought Myra as she gazed into the flames. Do you see anything? Asked Tilla as she sat down next to her. See anything? Myra echoed, no I don't. Apart from embers and smoldering ashes, that is. Why do you ask? Because sometimes people can see visions in the flames, said Tilla. You were looking at the fire so closely that I thought that you were seeing one. What kind of visions do people see? Asked Myra, intrigued. It varies, replied Tilla. Sometimes it's the future, other times it's the past, and sometimes it shows things that are happening right at that moment. Have you ever seen anything? Asked Myra. Once, answered Tilla, her face growing pale. A long time ago. What did you see? Asked Myra. I saw, Tilla began but stopped herself. She seemed disturbed, frightened by whatever it was that she had seen. It doesn't matter, she said at last. Sometimes the flames show you things that will never happen or things that never did happen. By seeing the future you alter it because you know about what's going to happen. Fire reading is very unreliable. It is also very rare and powerful, said old Aldred, who was sitting across from them on the other side of the bonfire. Never look too closely into the flames unless you don't mind being singed, he warned. Old King Eva the Unready found that out the hard way. He wanted to see his doom and prevent it, but only succeeded in hastening it. Foolish, stupid man. Eva the Unready? Asked Myra. I've never heard of him. And be grateful that you haven't, said Aldred. Eva the Unready, Eva the Unworthy, Eva the Foolhardy, and Eva the Tyrant. He is remembered as the worst king Arthuria ever had. He made enemies out of those who were his friends, and he made friends out of those who were his enemies. When his father, King Grom the Golden, was killed, Eva inherited control of a war being fought against the ancient Sulian Empire and the wicked feudalings. He very nearly lost the war. Arthuria was only kept from conquest by his generals and his many, many foreign mercenaries. He repaid these sellswords by giving them vast portions of his kingdom. These upstarts and lesser men founded their own kingdoms and many years later made war upon Eva. That fool should never have been crowned king. When his younger brother Bjorn rose up in rebellion and overthrew him, I rejoiced. I thought that Eva's ineptitude would never be outdone by any other king, that is until Moribund took the throne. I wouldn't say that if I were you, old Aldred, warned Tilla. You know Her Highness has forbidden any slander against her father. I am aware of this, little one, Aldred replied, but you must remember that I am far older than you or her. I never say anything lightly or frivolously. I have outlived all of the great kings of Arthuria, from Arthur the first High King right down through the ages, King Fravli, Arthanax first, second and third, Bulver the Bold and many others. I am old enough to remember them all, and I dare say that I am one of the few still living who can rightly pass judgment over them. When this current war is over, Moribund will be remembered as the worst king Arthuria ever had. Eva will be naught but a mere footnote by comparison. If Her Highness were ever to hear you say such a thing, Tilla began to say. She would be very angry at me, interrupted Aldred. She still has hope that His Highness may still repent of his past wicked deeds, said Tilla. She believes that Moribund may still be saved. That may be, sir, said Aldred, and if he does turn away from evil and truly atones for his actions against Draco Rex, then I shall recant my earlier words concerning him. But, I don't know if that is likely to happen or not. Myra sat in silence. She looked at the two Arthurians as a feeling of timelessness swept over her. It wasn't the first time that she had felt it since she had been here. She looked at Tilla and studied her for a moment. They appeared to be the same age, but Myra knew that she was over 1,000 years old. As for old Aldred, who could say just how old he was? When she looked at them, Myra could sense a tension between old Aldred and Tilla. They were gazing intently at one another across the fire. It was as if the two Arthurians were arguing without opening their mouths. Myra felt like she were an infant listening in on grown-up talk that she couldn't understand. After a few moments, Tilla appeared to yield to Aldred and bowed her head to him. Aldred nodded and rose from his seat. I shall take my leave of you, he said to them, sleep well. Aldred turned away and hobbled off into the darkness, leaning heavily on his cane. A few moments later the sound of a horse trotting away could be heard. I'm tired, yawned Tilla. Me too, said Myra, her eyes blinking heavily. The two girls rose from the log bench and laid down next to the fire. Good night, Tilla, said Myra as she closed her eyes. Sleep well, little sister, Tilla said. Little sister, said Myra, sitting up and giving Tilla a confused look. Why did you call me that? Tilla rolled over onto her stomach and propped herself up on her elbows. I am indebted to you, Myra, she replied. You saved my life when Maljas tried to kill me. But how does that make us sisters, said Myra. If I have to explain it to you, I'm not sure if you'll fully understand, said Tilla. My father considers the other chieftains to be his brothers. They have laughed, fought and adventured together for many, many years. They would do anything to help one another. They have saved one another more times than they can count. When you jumped out to protect me, I felt I knew what my father and the others meant when they called one another brother. I consider you to be my sister now. Myra blinked and mulled this over in her mind. This seemed to make a modicum of sense to her. Sisters. Myra said to herself, are you going to call me little sister all the time, or, if you don't want me to then I won't, Tilla interjected. I'm not sure if I'm against you calling me that or not, said Myra, I'll sleep on it. In that case, said Tilla, yawning once again, good night. The Arthurian girl closed her eyes and drifted off into sleep. Myra laid back and looked up at the twinkling stars overhead. She continued to think about what Tilla had said. Sisters, she thought as she looked over at Tilla, I wish you were my real sister. I miss mine so much. Myra looked back up at the stars. They were so clear and bright, obstructed only by the rising column of smoke from the fire. It was on a night like this when I lost you, Lena, she thought as she recalled that painful memory. She had been out stargazing with her friends. They had stayed up all night long, cooking marshmallows over a campfire and playing silly party games. When she had returned to her home in the morning, she had found her house ransacked and family missing. That had been a year ago. In the past month she had learned that the Sulians were the ones who were responsible for their disappearance. They were being held prisoner somewhere, out there, deep in the middle of the Sulian Empire. The mere thought of what her family must be suffering through broke Myra's heart. She blinked her eyes to fight back tears, but one managed to seep down her cheek. Myra wiped it away and buried her grief deep inside her. She was determined not to cry herself to sleep. It wasn't just her pride that made her think that, it was also the fact that her friends were sleeping all around her. Myra didn't want to wake them, and she certainly didn't want them to see her crying. She tried to make herself feel better by remembering the times when she and Lena would stay up after dark to watch for shooting stars. Myra pretended that Lena was lying next to her at that moment. The two she-elves smiled at one another and looked up at the night sky. Beautiful, whispered Myra. Yes it is, Lena replied. With that, Myra closed her eyes and surrendered herself to sleep.